Dust floated like golden motes in the late afternoon sun, drifting through the warped slats of the Dawson barn. Clara Belle Dawson stood barefoot on the splintered boards, the air thick with the smell of old hay and horse sweat. A fly buzzed lazily near her ear, and she swatted at it without conviction. Her father's shadow stretched long across the floor, slicing her figure in two, the darkness cutting through the light like a warning. Bartholomew Dawson was a man whose voice could still a room, and today it was sharp enough to split bone. "You've shamed this family," he said, his tone stripped of any pretense of love. He didn't call her by name. Not daughter, not Clara, just you, as if she were a problem to be solved, a burden to be unloaded. She kept her chin low, eyes fixed on the dusty floorboard. She knew better than to answer. Any protest would only stretch his temper thinner. The decision had been made before she even woke that morning. By the time they reached the edge of town, the heat of the day pressed down like a heavy palm on the back of her neck. Folks had gathered near the mercantile, the way they did whenever a Dawson was involved in something worth whispering about. Clara could feel their eyes before she saw them. She imagined what they saw: the cattle baron's fat, plain-faced daughter, her dress faded at the seams, her cheeks flushed, not from health but from the humiliation of being paraded like livestock. Solomon Reed stood by the hitching post, his posture straight but not rigid, his dark skin catching the sun in warm bronze tones. He wore a plain work shirt rolled at the sleeves, trousers patched at one knee. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes, deep and still, rested on her with a steadiness that unnerved her. Bartholomew didn't waste time. "You'll take her," he said, as if naming the price of a mule. "For your trouble, I'll forget the debt on that last load of timber you hauled." Clara's fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt. The words settled over the crowd like the first drops before a storm, soft, almost quiet, but charged with the promise of more. She caught a flash of Mrs. Hargrove's bonnet in the throng, the older woman leaning toward a friend, lips moving fast. She didn't have to hear the words to know what they were. Solomon didn't ask why. Didn't look at Bartholomew for confirmation. His gaze held hers for the briefest moment, not with pity, not with appraisal, just a strange, deliberate kind of acknowledgement. Then he nodded once, the smallest tilt of his chin, and said, "I'll take her." The exchange took less than a minute, but it carved a mark in Clara's life as deep as any canyon. Bartholomew turned without a farewell, his boots kicking up little storms of dust as he went. They left the murmuring crowd behind, walking the narrow trail out of town. Solomon's stride was longer than hers, but he slowed without making it obvious. The silence between them wasn't the cutting kind her father wielded. It was measured, almost respectful, as if words weren't to be wasted unless they mattered. The land shifted as they went. The neat fences and grazing cattle gave way to stretches of scrub and tangled mesquite, to places where the earth felt unclaimed. His home appeared at last, a small shack with a stone chimney and a narrow porch sagging slightly in the middle. Chickens clucked in a pen out back, and the scent of cedar smoke hung in the air. He pushed open the door and stood aside, letting her enter first. The single room was tidy in a way that spoke of habit rather than pride. A narrow bed stood in the corner, a wooden table set with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove with its belly still warm. On a shelf, a few worn books leaned together like old companions. "You can have the bed," he said simply. "Water pumps out back. Wash before supper." She nodded, unsure if thanks were expected. His voice was even, without the barbs she was used to. Yet there was no softness either, just plain fact, laid out like boards on a floor. As dusk folded over the land, she heard him outside, the faint creak of fence wire and the low murmur of a tune she didn't recognize. The sound carried through the thin walls, steady as a heartbeat. She lay on the bed, the coarse quilt rough under her fingertips, and listened until the melody gave way to the rustle of night. In the morning, she woke to the smell of cornbread. A small loaf sat on the table, steam still rising from its crust. Beside it lay a slip of paper, the handwriting neat but unadorned. *E. You'll need strength. Her fingers lingered on the paper longer than they should have. No one had left her anything before, not food, not words meant only for her. She tore off a piece of bread, the warmth seeping into her palms before melting across her tongue. Outside, the world stirred slowly. The sun climbed the horizon, the air carrying the faint scent of sage after the night's coolness. She stood in the doorway, watching Solomon work. He moved with the patience of someone who understood that the land answered only to its own pace. Midday brought them into town for supplies. The moment her boots touched the main street, she felt the weight of eyes again. Mrs. Hargrove stood in her doorway, arms folded, a look that skimmed over Clara as though measuring every flaw. "Lord save us," she muttered just loud enough. "What's the world coming to when a man takes another man's punishment into his home?" The words sank into Clara's chest like stones. She glanced at Solomon, expecting him to wince or scowl. Instead, he kept walking, his hand resting briefly at the small of her back, not pressing, not claiming, just enough to remind her she wasn't alone. Back at the shack, she set the groceries on the table while he stacked the firewood. Neither spoke of the comment, though it lingered between them like a faint echo. She found herself watching him as he worked, noticing how the lines of his face shifted in the firelight. There was a stillness to him, but not the cold kind. It was the stillness of deep water, the kind that could hold more than it showed. That night, she stepped outside. The air was crisp, stars spread across the sky like 1,000 small lanterns. Solomon sat on the porch, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. He didn't look up when she sat a few steps away, but the corners of his mouth softened, almost a smile. She drew her knees close, tucking her skirt around her ankles, and let the quiet stretch. It was different from the silences she'd known. Those had been traps, waiting to spring. This one felt like a place to rest. For the first time in years, she wasn't measuring herself by someone else's displeasure. The thought unsettled her, but it stayed all the same, a small seed planted in the dark. When she finally rose to go inside, Solomon's voice stopped her. "I'll be out here if you need anything." It was such a simple thing, almost nothing. Yet it followed her into sleep like the memory of a hand resting steady between her shoulders. The days began to settle into a rhythm, quiet but not without weight. Clara rose before the sun, often to find Solomon already outside, splitting wood or checking the chicken coop. He gave instructions without sharpness, his words measured, as if careful not to bruise the air between them. She learned how to plant rows of beans in the hard earth, how to coax the pump handle until the water ran clear, how to patch a roof with strips of tin. Her hands blistered at first, soft from years of being kept idle, but each new callus felt like a mark she had earned herself. One morning, while scattering feed for the hens, she startled when one bold bird darted forward and pecked her boot. The noise she made was half gasp, half laugh, an unguarded sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. She glanced toward the porch, where Solomon stood with a coil of rope in his hands. He was smiling, just faintly, the kind of smile that didn't demand she notice it but still warmed the space between them. Evenings became their quiet communion. They shared bread and beans by the fire, sometimes speaking, often not. When she did speak, it was about small things. The patterns of clouds before rain, the sound of the wind in the grass, a dream she once had about keeping bees in wooden hives. He never interrupted. He never asked why her voice trembled when she mentioned her father. He simply listened, as though her words had weight. Her confidence began to shift in small, nearly invisible ways. She walked with her chin a fraction higher. She met his gaze without flinching. She no longer measured her worth by how little space she took up in a room. Yet she still carried the old shame, folded and hidden like a letter no one must read. A trip to town reminded her how easily it could be unfolded. They needed flour, salt, and nails for the barn. The air in the mercantile felt close, smelling of tobacco and lamp oil. As they stepped inside, Mrs. Hargrove's eyes flicked to Clara's face, then to the space between her and Solomon, her mouth tightening. "Well," she said to no one in particular, though the words traveled easily in the stillness, "some folks don't mind carrying another man's shame home with their supplies." Clara froze, her hand tightening on the sack of flour. The laughter that followed was soft, but it cut like a thin blade. She felt the familiar flush rise to her cheeks, the urge to shrink back into herself. Before the old instinct could swallow her whole, Solomon moved forward, took the flour from her hands, and paid for their goods without a single glance toward the woman. When they stepped back into the sunlight, his hand found the small of her back again, the same steadying touch as before. He said nothing, but the gesture was enough to keep her standing tall as they walked away. That night, she thought about the way he hadn't defended her with words but had simply carried on, as if the cruelty had no place in their world. She realized it was the first time someone hadn't turned her into a spectacle in return for her humiliation. It was as though his quietness was a wall, keeping the noise of others from reaching her. The wall was tested sooner than she expected. 3 nights later, the sound of hooves broke the calm. Lantern lights swung outside as a rider approached, the glow catching on the hard angles of Bartholomew Dawson's face. He dismounted with a drunken stagger, boots crunching on the gravel path. "Clara Belle," he bellowed, the name slurred. "You come out here right now." She stepped to the doorway before she could think better of it, her body moving out of habit. Solomon appeared from the shadows, placing himself between her and the steps. Bartholomew's eyes narrowed, his voice laced with venom. "I've changed my mind. She's coming home. I won't have her shaming the family any longer than she already has. You've had your fun, Reed. Time to give her back." Her breath caught. The old pull to obey was strong, tugging at her bones, whispering that resistance was pointless. Solomon didn't move. His voice was low, steady, carrying more weight than if he'd shouted. "She's not yours to give anymore." The night seemed to pause. Even the insects held their song. Bartholomew took a step forward, but something in the way Solomon stood, rooted, immovable, made him hesitate. For a moment, Clara saw her father not as the towering force of her childhood, but as a man confronted with a will he could not bend. "You'll regret this," Bartholomew spat, but his words lacked the iron they once had. He turned, mounted his horse with an unsteady swing, and rode into the darkness, leaving only the fading sound of hooves behind. Clara's knees felt weak, but the air in her lungs was clearer than she could remember. No one had ever stood between her and her father's wrath before. It was not just an act of protection, it was a declaration, quiet but absolute, that she was worth standing for. In the days that followed, she moved with a new certainty. She began tending a small plot of land behind the shack, marking rows for the vegetables and, in one corner, setting aside space for something she had only spoken of in dreams. Solomon helped her build the frame for her first beehive box, his hands steady as they hammered the boards into place. When the hive was finished, they carried it to the garden's edge together. The air was thick with the scent of new growth, the sky a wide canvas of late spring blue. She ran her hand along the smooth wood, feeling the hum of possibility beneath her fingertips. That evening, after supper, Solomon reached for a jar from the shelf. Inside, the honey caught the firelight, turning it to liquid gold. He set it in front of her. "For you," he said, his voice the same quiet evenness she had come to know. She looked at him, and in his eyes she saw no trace of pity, no hint of condescension, only a respect so steady it felt like the ground beneath her feet. It was not the language of romance she had read about in books, but something far rarer, the recognition of her whole self, without condition. Outside, the night stretched open and calm, the stars wheeling above in their silent arcs. She dipped a finger into the jar, tasting the sweetness, and let it linger on her tongue. It was the first thing in her life that tasted entirely hers, and as the fire crackled and the bees slept in their new home, she realized the story she was living was no longer about punishment or shame. It was about the slow, deliberate way a life could be rebuilt when someone believed you were worth the work.